Just wait a second. See, probably wait till like 3:05 Eastern just to make sure.
Okay, that works for me.
Mhm. All right, welcome everyone. It's nice to see some people here. I know some more are trickling in, but just in the interest of time, I'll go ahead and start. So on behalf of the American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar for Dr. Roberto Orozco's outstanding dissertation. My name is Kayla, and I will be assisting as needed during this session. Please spend a moment to ensure that you have a clean connection. And after the presentation by our esteemed presenter, we will enter a period of participation Q&A. We ask that you please submit your questions through the Q&A box on Zoom, and please feel free to engage with both the presenter and attendees by using the chat function throughout the webinar. And finally, this is a live webinar and it is being recorded. We thank each of you for attending. Now I will turn the session over to Dr. Orozco.
Thank you all for joining, and thank you, Kayla and AAHHE, for inviting me to share my dissertation work, specifically thinking about queer and trans Latinx college students. I'll get right into it just for time purposes, and definitely want to have a conversation, a dialogue, or for the question and answer component and be able to engage in that respect with the participants. The title of my work was Aquí, entre, examining the identity and socio-political consciousness development of queer Latinx AO college student activists, particularly through the framework of the Muxerista activist consciousness development framework, which I'll be introducing later on in my presentation, and what culminated out of my dissertation work. So just to kind of keep us on track and to provide a framework for what I'll be sharing today, I'll be talking about what brought me to this work and really also presenting my epistemological grounding, what leads me and kind of thinking about how I view my work and thinking about knowledge production, presenting a little bit about the literature, very briefly, the literature review, also engaging with the concept of Joteria studies, and the path of conocimiento, which served as the foundation for my work. The purpose of the research study, introducing the research questions, thinking about my work within a particular community, time, and space, and then engaging with the methodology of my work, and then the culmination of the Muxerista activist conscious development framework. And then finally, I'll be offering some ofrendas for community research and practice. So as opposed to implications, I'll be, providing some ofrendas, which translates into offerings for those of you who are sharing space with us today. And then we'll provide some time for questions as well. So when I think about my work and when I think about myself also as a scholar, and more specifically as a Joto scholar, I go back to, this picture right here, as you can see, 1995. Thinking about in 1999, both of these pictures represent part of my own story of being a little Joto, a little queer in growing up in Iowa, growing up around predominantly Latinx, more specifically Mexican community. And
sorry to interrupt, Roberto. I don't think we can see the pictures. I'm not sure if the slides are moving. You maybe unsharing and then resharing your screen might help. Just troubleshoot maybe.
Can you see it now?
Yes, I see the presentation flow. Yes, okay, it's working. Perfect.
Okay, so it's working now? Okay. Please stop me if it doesn't work again. But here, going back to of what brought me to this work is thinking about how my work with queer and trans Latinx people is sort of an ofrenda to my younger self, someone who had to really think about how I navigated my queerness in multiple spaces, but for me, particularly growing up in a predominantly Mexican, area, predominantly Mexican, like traditional values, and what it meant for me to be queer, but not be able to name that. And so I always think about my work as kind of giving back to my inner child, giving back to that younger self in ways that, the suppression that happened within my own internal voice and experiences is now something that I'm obviously, contributing to working through and on. And so I really think about this work as giving back. And then thinking about 2009, here you'll see another picture of the Mexican American Young Achiever Society. In 2009, I was an undergrad at Iowa State. And why this is such a pivotal organization, but also an important part of my experience was because this was also when I became involved with a lot of student activism as a student myself at Iowa State, particularly thinking about how students of color were not being supported in ways that we should have been supported by the administration, but also by the university. And so a lot of my activism was surrounding, resources, access, support for students of color, particularly because we made up less than 10% of the student population at Iowa State. So, going to a predominantly and historically white institution, part of that activism was holding the institution accountable to make sure that if they're bringing us to campus, what are they doing to actually support us through this experience? And so that's really where my activism kind of started, but also where my journey into higher education and student affairs started, and thinking about how I support students through their own journeys, which then led me to years later, after receiving my master's, going to the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where I served as the director of the Center for Social Justice. This was also a very pivotal time in my own journey because while in undergrad, I hadn't named my sexuality either. And part of that was because there was so much focus on the racial ethnic movement on campus that I look back and reflect now and thinking about whether bringing in issues around gender and sexuality would have been beneficial. Like, yes, it would have been beneficial, but I don't know if my community would have had the ability to hold the space for those of us who were queer and trans to really talk about these issues, specifically queer and trans people of color. So in 2015 was a very pivotal moment because it's when I came into this community, which is the Muxerista community. And it's a intergenerational queer and trans Latinx community of student activists, faculty, staff who are committed to social change. And so this was when I started to name my own queerness, but also when my politics started to shift in thinking about how I was showing up in my work as a student affairs professional, but also as a higher education scholar. And all of that brings me to my epistemological grounding in Chicana Latina feminism, which really talks about constituting a personal, social, and political stance that undermines patriarchy as it cross-cuts forms of multiple sites of oppression. And so for me, it's not just about the racial, ethnic systems of oppression, but also thinking about the ways that sexuality, gender, class, and other identities play a part in the ways we view the world, but the ways we experience the world as well. So this leads me into the dissertation project. Coming into my dissertation, I was really interested in thinking about student activism, but also student activism as a site of development for queer and trans Latinx students. And particularly why is because of the students that I was working with and doing work alongside at UNLV. And so when we think about college student development, there is a need to really think about college student development from this third wave of college student development that really thinks about development as more than just an individual experience, but one that captures the social sites of oppression and the ways that we view these structures of oppression and how they also are intertwined with development, right? but not just viewing these types of oppression, but also thinking about what are the actions that are happening to push back, resist, and create these particular changes within different spaces. When we think about queer Latinx college student research, a lot of it has been around, the coming out process, the negative and positive, kind of experiences that students have had with naming their sexuality, whether that in different spaces, whether that's with family, with friends, whether that's, in their social spheres back at home or in their spheres on college campuses, right? And so part of that coming out has also led us to thinking about the ways they live multiple and contradicting truths as queer Latinx individuals and how they negotiate and navigate those spaces. And so one of the areas that, for me, I see my research kind of contributing to is the ways that we think about queer Latinx college student development, particularly from a anti-deficit approach, right? So not necessarily thinking about the negative consequences, but really the ways that coming out and naming one's sexuality allows people to really think about their development, right? And then thinking about Latinx college student activism, a lot of it has really focused from a heteronormative understanding of Latinx college student activism. So I really, one of the things that my work does is really thinking about how we push back and resist this heteronormative understanding of who and what is Latino, Latina, Latinx, right? And so part of my work is contributing to that area as well. A shift in my work is the ways that as a higher education scholar, I bring in joteria studies. And joteria is a term that derives from reclaiming historically derogatory terms like joto and jota, also other terms, such as pato, maricon. And so thinking about the multiple derogatory terms that have been associated with queer and trans people, joteria study seeks to reclaim those terms, but also seeks to resist multiple forms of oppression, such as racism, queer antagonism, sexism, and patriarchy. But part of joteria studies is not just using the term joteria as its signifier for a queer identity, right? And not just as a translation for queerness, but more so the epistemological and ontological foundations of joteria is really thinking about joteria as more than just this identity predicated on sexual desire. So not just what it means to be joteria, but also what does it mean to do joteria, and who does joteria and how do we do joteria, right? And so part of this is the active resistance and challenging of multiple sites of oppression through the doing of joteria. And so this leads me to the path of conocimiento. For those of you who are familiar with Gloria Anzaldua's work, she offers the path of conocimiento as really what I consider a developmental framework, particularly for queer and trans people. And while it is within the purview of Chicana Latina feminism, it's also important to name the path of conocimiento as a joteria framework. Anzaldúa terms this path of conocimiento as a joteria framework, right? When she calls on us to listen to our joteria, but also in thinking about not only the call for us to listen to our joteria, but also her own individual experience as a Chicana, Latina, lesbian in living on the border of the US-Mexico border in the borderlands, right? And so for me, I do think about the path of conocimiento as a joteria framework, and one that illuminates a process of reflective consciousness, and one that challenges conventional knowledge's current categories, classifications, and contents for the identity and socio-political conscious development of queer Latinx people. So when we think about the path of conocimiento, is really this coming into a critical consciousness, but also into one's own identities, right? And thinking about the negotiations that continue to happen for queer and trans people as they come to name, but also stand in their joteria. And while identity development has largely focused on the cognitive and behavioral processes, what the path of conocimiento offers us is a way to look at development as also engaging the visceral experience of the body, right? So how do people experience these types of oppression, but also what happens to the body when we're in community with other queer and trans people? How does our body queer up spaces, right? And so for me, the path of conocimiento allows us to bring that corporeal understanding of development, specifically for queer and trans people, queer and trans Latinx people. And so here, this is a kind of like an image that I created that really allows us to understand each part of the path of conocimiento. There are 7 kind of stages that Anzaldúa calls them. And for me, I really think about them as, like reciprocal spaces. So while it looks kind of cyclical, for me, there's a level of reciprocity that happens with each one of these spaces, right? So when we think about arrebato, the arrebato is really these ruptures that happens in one's identity, one's experiences, one's knowledges, and as Anzaldúa calls it, the space of ending and new beginning, a space of exploration of new identity formation, which in turn pushes one to Nepantla, which Nepantla, for those of you who are familiar with Gloria Anzaldúa's Borderlands, is really this space of in-between, right? This space of having to negotiate multiple spaces of either contradictions, tensions, and what does it mean to continue to be in that space of in-between. Coatlicue is a place of constructing one's own reality and facing one's identity conflict, understanding the cost of being true to oneself, right? So again, the continual negotiation that happens through this paso conocimiento is something that is seen through each of these kind of stages that Anzaldúa terms. The call de compromiso is a space where inner voice is fostered that pushes one to follow their passion and identities, although they still might go against community. So what does it mean to continue to negotiate one's identity, knowing that one may be going against what they've been taught, what they've been told, or the societal pressures that one kind of carries with them as they think about their own identities, and specifically for queer and trans Latinx people, what does it mean to name those, and what relationships do we lose along the process of naming our realities, which in turn, pushes us into this putting Koyoshaki together, right? So Koyoshaki is Aztec goddess, right, who was dismembered by her brother because of the relationship between Koyoshaki and her mother. And so there's going back to kind of this image, you see these different parts of an individual. Anzaldúa really talks about the dismemberment that happens for people, right? Both the physical, emotional, mental dismemberments of oneself as one starts to really engage with their true reality and come into kind of their own authentic, but also unapologetic self. And so all of this leads us into this middle section of spiritual activism. So constructing and sketching a new reality by picking up dismembered pieces of the old self and being able to live, that reality, knowing that there's always going to be tensions and there's always going to be negotiations happening within oneself, but allowing one to have a better understanding of where they stand and the foundation that they've created. And so for me, again, I see this path of conocimiento as not just one like you go from one stage to the next and then you're done, but one that continuously happens depending on the context, the time, and the space that one is in, and the community that one is surrounded by. And so this leads me to the purpose, again, of my dissertation, which was to examine the identity and socio-political conscious development of queer Latinx college students in higher education. I offer here briefly the two, how I'm thinking about identity development, but also socio-political consciousness. So I think about identity development as the meaning individuals ascribe to their experiences in conjunction with their social positions and attention to structures of inequality. So again, within the third wave of college student development, I really think about the ways that individuals are not only thinking about their social positions and social identities, but also the ways that those social positions engage with and are informed by the realities of the structures of inequality that sometimes are attached to those, social identities, depending on the privilege and oppression that they may experience. And thinking about socio-political consciousness is having a critical analytical lens connected to identity and social justice issues. Furthermore, connecting to an analysis of systems of oppression to praxis. So not only what does it mean to understand, but what are the actions that one is also taking in order to resist and push back and challenge these systems of oppression. And so there was 4 research questions that served to guide my my dissertation. The first one is, how do queer Latinx college students in higher education construct meaning of their ethnic identity, gender, and sexuality in the context of their activism? How do queer Latinx college students negotiate their ethnic identity, gender, and sexuality in different contexts? What forms of resistance do queer Latinx college students utilize in their practice of activism? And in what ways do queer Latinx college students build sites of queer kinships and liberation? Kayla, can you still see the screen?
Yes, the research question screen.
I just wanted to double check. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And so in framing my work, I think about community, time, and space. Part of it goes back to my epistemological grounding in the ways that Chicana Latina feminism asks us to consider community, time, and space, and to really locate our work within particular time and spaces, right? And so this is a quick kind of snapshot of the ways that I think about my work within the community, time, and space of UNLV, so the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and Las Vegas on a broader level as well, specifically within the Muxerista community. And so, as I said before, Muxerista is an intersectional queer feminist praxis rooted in the resistance of multidimensional struggles with the foundation of community, love, and healing. And so I specifically chose to look at individuals who were engaged in activism in broader Las Vegas, but also in student activism within UNLV from the years 2006, 2016. I chose these particular dates because there was multiple events that happened that informed the activism that was happening both on campus and off campus by these students, right? So in 2006, we see one of the largest immigrant rights movements happening across the country. And this was also a time that put Las Vegas on a map, particularly within immigrant rights, because I think a lot of folks didn't really see Las Vegas as a site of resistance. And so in 2006, Las Vegas was one of, I think, one of the top 3 or 5 cities in the country who had the largest turnout for immigrant rights movements, right? But also there was multiple student walkouts happening that were taking place in Las Vegas, particularly by high school students, right? Who were being impacted by the legislations that were trying to be passed on a national level, but also in particular, the legislation that the local and state government were trying to pass within Las Vegas, but the broader state of Nevada as well. In 2007, 2009, we see the development of United Coalition for Immigrant Rights, which was a student organization founded at UNLV and in Vegas by Muxeristas, right? Folks who were committed to immigrant rights activism, but folks who were committed to immigrant rights activism through an intersectional lens, right? Who were asking immigrant rights activists to really think about immigrant rights as more than just a focus on immigration, but one that also has to take into account race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality, right? And so at the same time, we see the Association for Joteria Arts, Activism, and Scholarship kind of beginning the foundation of the organization. And so this is where we really see these students take on a Joteria kind of consciousness and what it means to really name Joteria, right? And then in 2008, 2012, and 2009, 2013, and 2015, 2017, these are where we see a lot more activism happening within campus at UNLV. So in 2008 was really the fight against women and gender studies department budget cuts. And why this is so central to kind of the students who were part of this study, the collaborators, was because a lot of the collaborators talked about their experiences as either majors or minors in the Women and Gender Studies department, but department being so integral to their experiences was because these were the spaces where they were learning about activism, but also these were the spaces where they were learning how to be activists, right? And so for them, it was really like, not only are we learning this, but now we have to put it into practice, right? how are we holding ourselves responsible for making sure that we have the resources that we are pushing back against the administration to make sure that we are being supported, and they don't take away departments like Women and Gender Studies, which served as integral spaces of support for a lot of these students. In 2009, 2013, we see the advocating for a multicultural center on campus, which then became the Center for Social Justice. And so for me, this was also really important because when I think about my time and my role as a director of the Center for Social Justice, I always had to sit with the fact that the center was created out of student activism. So for me, how do I hold true to that vision and mission that the students had in creating the center, but also the work and labor that went into, eventually creating my position, right? And so how was I giving back to the community, and how was I staying true to the mission and vision of the center in ways that allowed us to really focus on activism, but also social change within the university, but also within the larger community in Las Vegas. And in 2015, 2017, we see that kind of this younger generation of mujeristas really engaging with the racial campus movement that we saw, right? Particularly the events that happened at Mizzou, the University of Missouri, Columbia, and in ways that a lot of universities, a lot of students at different universities across the country were starting to kind of take on their activism as well to hold their institutions accountable. So we also see that at this time, students at UNLV, they were holding a stand in solidarity with Mizzou event, but it turned into an event that propelled them to really think about how are we being supported? How are we not getting the resources that we need? And we have the administration here. How can we hold them accountable, and how can we start having those conversations to particularly support students of color, undocumented students, and queer and trans students on campus, particularly because UNLV at the time was one of the top 2 most diverse institutions in the country. And so here are just some images. There's a chapter in my dissertation that I actually omitted, which was a historical count of the different events that kind of led into thinking about the Muxerista community, but also the multiple events that led into the development of these student activist experiences and their socio-political conscious development as well. And see, right here, we see that a lot of these events focused on queer and trans identities, right? And really thinking about the ways that their activism was centered on their queer and trans experiences. And so I used the critical grounded theory in my work, and part of that was because it was really about theorizing the development that was happening within the collaborators of the study. And so a critical grounded theory also allows us to not only theorize, but also interrogate the structures of oppression toward possibilities of being and doing. And so what does it mean to develop theory, particularly with the focus on the ways that structures of oppression inform theory creation, but also social change? And so more specifically, I use pláticas, and I engage in a process of pláticas with all of my collaborators. And pláticas allowed a space of vulnerability, a space of reciprocity, but also a space of healing, for us to really talk about how individuals came into their identities, the journey of their familias to Vegas, right? What brought them to Vegas? What brought them to activism? How do they define activism? How do they define their own social identities, their own race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality? What does it mean to them? But also, how do they engage in healing? How is their activist practices informed by healing, right? And informed by giving back to each other, but also this space of vulnerability. And so, as I note here, throughout the pláticas, there was a level holding space for each other as queer Latinx people and as mujeristas. And so in pláticas allowed me to not only ask them questions, right? And have them share their stories, but it allowed me to share my own story as well, because I am a part of the Muxerista community, right? And so for me, using pláticas was really about giving back to each other in the process of talking about our own developmental experiences. Here I note at the bottom, while I didn't specifically use queer pláticas, me and my colegas, Dr. Angel Gonzalez and Sergio Gonzalez, recently published an article this year on theorizing queer pláticas for queer and trans Latinx research. And so part of what came out of each of our pláticas that we use in our dissertations was thinking further about pláticas as, contributing to queer pláticas, right? In the ways that we kind of built relationships, but also built that level of trust and reciprocity and vulnerability with each other in the process of engaging in queer and trans research. So I invite you all to read the article. We can send it out, or I can provide the information after the session. And so in thinking about how I came to the framework that I'm going to share with you all, it was really about having the pathoconocimiento guide my analysis. For each of the collaborators, I had 15 collaborators. I created kind of like this diagram for them. I created a diagram based on how they came into their activism, the activist journeys they had, as you can see here, but also how they came into their queer Latinx identities and the different experiences they had. And so there was a lot of mapping, a lot of diagramming happening, which then in turn allowed me to kind of think about the framework that contributes to how I see development happening within my dissertation. And so as you can see the pictures here, all of this culminated into, in the next slide, I'll show you the framework. And so the collaborators in my study, again, one unique aspect of my dissertation was the fact that I wasn't interviewing current undergraduate students, but I was interviewing alumni, right? Individuals who were reflecting back on their experiences of being queer and trans activists at that time, but also asking them questions about where are you now with your queer and or trans Latinx identity? How do you see yourself? How do you see community? How do you see activism, right? And so it was really about learning how they were activists at a younger age, through their undergraduate experiences, but also how, as they started to gain more knowledge, their politics started to shift, right? Their understanding of how to engage in activism and what activism was also started to shift. And so as you can see here, the age of the collaborators ranged from 24 to 40. In terms of gender and sexuality, it was also, different genders and sexualities. And then thinking about how 6 of the 15 collaborators also identify as undocumented, and 14 out of the 15 collaborators spoke to having an immigrant background connected to their family's history. So all of this that I presented led to what I termed the Muxerista Activist Conscious Development Framework, and a framework that I hope helps to serve to understand how we think about activism, particularly happening for queer and trans Latinx people, but also identity development, right, and socio-political conscious development. And this is what culminated out of my dissertation, this framework. As you can see, there are kind of pieces of the pathoconocimiento that also are part of my own framework. And so when we think about this first area, the sites of ruptures and heridas, we think about these kind of arrebatos, right? These experiences that individuals have that propel them to think more critically about themselves, right? So not only discovering a queer identity, right? So there was moments where individuals were really thinking about, who am I? What am I? And part of this was either being surrounded by other folks who were questioning their sexuality, questioning their gender, but also the spaces that they were in, right? Being in activist spaces, being in gender and sexuality studies courses, also thinking about how they came into an activist identity, right? For them, it was really about, how did you become an activist? How, what do you identify an activist being? What is activism for you? And all of this leading to developing a socio-political consciousness, which then in turn leads us to the dismemberment of the mind-body, which here we really think about how collaborators were undoing gender and sexuality, right? So they were really challenging kind of these ways that either their families, friends, and people around them were conceptualizing gender and sexuality, right? And how, as queer and trans people, they really had to undo these heteronormative ideas of what gender and sexuality meant for them, which in turn challenged their families' expectations, right? Especially when their families kind of viewed them as, these heterosexual beings, right? But also propel them to negotiate the self and organizing in activist spaces. What did it mean to have to bring up issues of gender and sexuality in heteronormative activist spaces, right? And what were the repercussions that happened as well, having to, name that or negotiate that. And then all of this leading into claiming a mujerista joteria consciousness, which this was kind of the space where individuals really started to come into their own joteria, started to really name their sexuality, but also started to really name their politics, right? And so part of this was having a mujerista joteria feminist politics, queering the environment through the physical body, right? So for a lot of them, it was around like, how does my presence as a queer and trans people shift the environment around me, right? And so part of that was physically being able to see the way that the conversation shifted by just bringing up gender and sexuality in terms of different conversations. An example of that was the May Day marches that were happening, that happened every May 1st. A lot of it was guided by community members. And so for the Mujerista activists, they would bring in issues of gender and sexuality, and that just alone would shift the conversations to thinking about immigrant rights as more than just being about immigration, but one that also engages, different sides of social positions such as race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality, right? And that immigration is not just a Latinx issue, but it's an issue that encompasses different communities, which then in turn leads into this healing as a mujerista practice in the ways that different collaborators kind of arrived at the space of healing, right? And healing being a part of their practice as they started to continue to engage in activism, but that for many of them, healing came because of the burnout they experienced by having to engage and feeling the responsibility to engage in multiple activist, events, practices, or feeling the responsibility to have to name, the different inequalities that were happening around them. And lastly, I also add the imagining possibilities, visionary organizing. So this framework also allows us to think about how queer and trans people create worlds that may not exist around us, right? And the ways that they center joy and love in this queer and feminist world making, right? So something that I term queer futurity in my work is thinking about the ways that collaborators really think about a world that we are allowed to create within each other, but that the rest of society might not create for us, right? How do we create these worlds within ourselves little by little? And so that is the Mujerista activist conscious development framework. In the next part, I'm going to share quickly some quotes or some of the collaborators, because I really want us to have some time for question and answer. And so when we think about the sites of ruptures and heridas, again, here's where individuals are starting to come into their own identity, starting to really think about how they identify as an activist, but also developing that socio-political consciousness. So one of the quotes that I want to share is by Latinx P, who now is 41, and who's a queer woman who identifies as queer, but also a woman who loves women, Puerto Rican and Cuban, and was part of the early generation of mujeres. So when we think about that community, time, and space timeline that I shared, Latinx P was really involved at the earlier 2006 timeframe compared to the younger generations who were kind of 2013 and 2016 timeframe. So Latinx P shares, I have reflected on our conversation quite a bit during our first Plática, and with the journey of being in Las Vegas and the discovery phase, right? Because it definitely wasn't a coming out phase. It was more of a discovery phase for myself and trying to figure out what community looked like in terms of the queer and the Latinx community, pero también where I identify in that community. So here, Latinx P really shares naming their sexuality as a discovery phase more than just a coming out experience. And for, this is reflected in a lot of the collaborators' experiences, because for a lot of them, they didn't say, oh, I came out and I just said my sexuality. It was, I really had to think about, how do I identify? Because I was either in my gender and sexuality courses, or I was surrounded by other queer and trans people who were also questioning their own gender and sexuality. So it allowed them to feel safe. It allowed them to feel like they weren't the only one who were going through these experiences. And so again, it wasn't more of a coming out phase, right? It was more of a discovery phase where there was multiple things that were leading them to really think critically about who they were, but not only who they were individually, but who they were with community as well. And so here Valentina shares, so eventually at some point I continued with gender studies and women's studies courses. So Valentina it was a queer fluid Chicana Latina who was part of the younger generation of Muxeristas, and they changed their major halfway through their undergraduate experience to being in gender studies and women's studies courses. And she goes on to say, and it was there when we were in class and we're like introducing each other or whatever, talking about sexuality, that I was like, I'm bi or I'm queer. That was the first time I said that out loud. And I was like, that's what it is. That feels good to me. I feel like people always represent coming out like a really huge moment. And it wasn't like a huge moment for me. It was just like something clicked and it felt right. It was like a feeling of, yeah, I'm home kind of feeling within myself. So again, for Valentina, this really reflects kind of coming into a queer identity. Part of it was because they were getting the time, they were to really reflect on who they were, right? But they were also in a space of feeling safe with other people. Particularly for Valentina, this happened for them in their gender studies and women's studies courses. When we think about the dismemberment of the mind and body, this is, again, where the negotiation of the self continues to happen, right? Challenging family, friends, expectations of oneself, but also really undoing and untethering what we think about as gender and sexuality. And so here, I'll share what Yarimad kind of shared with me in our plática was, and I started questioning the relationship with myself and my body and like checking off all these boxes. Well, this one way never felt right. And then I find out that biological sex isn't real. What you see isn't real. And it was all within the same day, literally where I went to like different lectures on the same day and my mind was broken for 2 whole weeks. I couldn't process new information because I had just literally broken up my entire life by deconstructing gender, deconstructing sex, and deconstructing who I was attracted to. I couldn't focus. I could not think outside of those boxes for 2 whole weeks. And I'm just like, even now I get shaky about it. Like I'm kind of shaking and I should probably take a deep breath, right? So in our plática, Yarimad had a very real visceral experience in reflecting back on how they started to identify as queer and trans. And for them, it happened going to different events, particularly hosted by gender and sexuality studies, where they brought in scholars, they brought in activists to talk about different issues surrounding queer and trans individuals, but also queer and trans issues. And for Yarimad, this is one of the first moments where they really started to think about who they were, right? And so for them, it was physically thinking about their bodies as, is this, what I've been told, is this who I am? Is this how I'm living my life? Or is this a time for me to really reflect on who I am with the realities that I'm trying to live out, right? So here we see the dismemberment of the mind-body happening for Yarimad. Rita also shares, again, challenging families' expectations, where she shares, when I came out to my mom, I think I came out to her in 2008 or 2009, she was initially not supportive of my queerness. And it was very jarring for me because she was very supportive of my queer friends. And she knew a lot of my friends were queer, but when I came out to her, like she really rejected my queerness and responded very negatively to me coming out. So I also felt like I couldn't be like my full queer self in my home, because my mom and her kind of very homophobic reaction to my coming out. So in some ways, even though I felt like my feminism and my activism was validated by my family, my queerness wasn't validated by them. And there was a big impact on my spirit because of that response from my mom. And so for Rita, it was the contradictions that existed because of her mom, because of her coming out to her mom and naming her sexuality to her mom. Her mom wasn't supportive of her at first. And so for her, it was those contradictions of, how are you not supportive of your own child, but you're supportive of all my other friends, right? So it was really having to navigate and negotiate their gender, their sexuality within that space and their relationship with their mother, which many collaborators in my dissertation talked about their relationship with their mother specifically. But that's a whole nother conversation, a paper that I'm actually working on. And I can definitely answer any questions folks have at the end about the mother and the relationship with queer and trans Latinx people. So claiming a Muxerista joteria consciousness here is where folks start to come into their politics, into their consciousness unapologetically. And so I share again another quote by Rita. She says, and because so many of us were becoming queer, Mecha, which was a student organization on campus, became a very queer space at UNLV too. Like there were already some queer folks who were co-chairs and stuff, but it became almost majority queer. And we pushed out a lot of the folks who were patriarchs, and we show up to national Mecha conferences and we roll deep like as like a queer chapter, you know, and like build alliances with other queer chapters so that we can on a national level make changes to the patriarchal structures and the patriarchal leadership. So that was also a huge thing, like feeling like that kind of power in our queerness and showing up visibly on a national level, representing as queer and feminist student organizers. So here Rita talks about the ways that, you know, their Muxerista joteria consciousness, you know, informed their politics and the ways that they were informing the student organizations they were a part of, but not only at the university level for them, but also when they were going to national meetings, the ways that they were building alliances with other queer students to really center queer and trans issues, queer and trans knowledges and experiences in the ways that an organization like Mecha, which has historically been focused on Mexican-American and Chicano students from a very patriarchal standpoint, that they were the ways that they were challenging this historical legacy of patriarchy in an organization like Mecha. And so here I'll share a quote from each of the next two, which healing as a Muxerista practices the way that individuals, the way that healing was a part of this framework, right? And the ways that it informed not only their identity and socio-political consciousness development, but also their practice of activism. Here I share with, I'm actually gonna share Martella's quote, where Martella shares, I think healing requires you to question and to be open to change. There's a lot of death that happens within you of like parts of you felt you couldn't part with, where are so fundamental and so much at your core. It's like being broken and unraveling and undone. You know, in some ways, and I think feminism and being a part of those spaces required us to look within. We don't realize that we have disease because we don't know how to deal with big emotions. And we don't know, we're basically rehumanizing ourselves. Like, I think that's what healing is. It's like you're learning to be a human because for so long, certain structures require you to dehumanize yourself. And so Martella really talks about this space of healing, you know, connected to what I shared earlier, the Koyoshaki imperative, right? That putting Koyoshaki together of the ways that, you know, these systems of oppression basically create dismembered parts of ourselves, both physically, emotionally, mentally, as queer and trans Latinx people. And so for Martella, healing was very integral to understand how do we rehumanize ourselves, not only individually, but also how do we rehumanize ourselves in community and with each other, right? And so what does that mean to hold space for each other in our healing practices and in our healing journeys? And then the last, imagining possibilities, visionary organizing, is where we really think about queer world making, right, for queer and trans Latinx people as shared by the collaborators. And so Maya shares, I feel like we realized there was a switch where we're getting a lot of incoming undergrad students and our levels of consciousness were different, right? And so instead of moving on, we started doing. So here we see this kind of intergenerational knowledge being passed down from older generation of Muxeristas to younger generations of Muxeristas. I remember thinking, oh, now it's my time to teach. Now it's my time to mentor somebody else in a way that doesn't feel paternalistic, in a way that, and I remember we started talking about like, how do we check with love, you know? It's like when these conversations started blooming around, like, how do we want it to be together? Part of it, being a queer Muxerista, specifically being queer, already challenges the concept of family. So coming in with that queer lens, I think helped us create a group of activist folks who are committed to each other and to the work. So Maya goes on to share that for her, you know, as she was getting ready to graduate and she saw that there was undergrads, you know, incoming undergrad students coming into these organizations, into these activist spaces, it could be easy to just, you know, if someone said something problematic, to just say, no, you can no longer be a part of our group, or to like check them in a way that wasn't always nice or that could come off as being, you know, violent. And so for Maya, it was more about like, how do we do this with love, right? How do we pass on the knowledge that we've gotten so that incoming students who are taking up the activism that we created don't have to recreate all these different things or don't have to like build all these relationships from scratch, but they can take on the knowledge that we've already acquired and kind of build it into their own, right? And continue to really think about how they're changing the university, how they're changing these different spaces from an intergenerational knowledge perspective. And so, again, here's the Muxerista Activist Conscious Development Framework. I know that I kind of shared the findings pretty quickly. So definitely, if anyone has any questions during the Q&A, I would be happy to answer. But I want to leave you all with ofrendas of community research and practice, because in my dissertation, again, I didn't talk about implications, but I talked more about there's offerings, there's ofrendas that I want to offer queer and trans people, faculty, staff, researchers, practitioners. And so the first one is centered around queer futurity. A central ofrenda of this research study is the possibilities that exist for other queer Latinx people, specifically queer Latinx college students, to see themselves in the multiple narratives, experiences, and knowledges shared by the 15 collaborators. So I think about the ways that we're able to create Muxerista communities in different spaces, right? And so while the Muxerista community has been central to the city of Las Vegas, the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, one of the integral parts has also been seeing this Muxerista community kind of go into different spaces, right? There's actually a pipeline in Muxeristas that have come to Minnesota. So I'm at the University of Minnesota, and previous to me, there was 3 Muxeristas who were getting their masters and doctorates here at this university. And there's other folks that have gone to California, other spaces, right? And so part of being a part of the Muxerista community has been, how do you hold on to these values when entering into different activist spaces to make sure that we're creating kind of like these Muxerista pockets around, you know, the country, and thinking about Muxerista as not just something that happens in Vegas, but a knowledge production and activist practices that we take with us throughout our, you know, our experiences as activists, but our experiences also either as scholars, practitioners, community members. And so for me, that's something, that's one of the first ofrendas, thinking about queer futurity and the ways that we build Muxerista communities in different spaces. The second one is intergenerational knowledge. And the ofrenda of this research is the ways that the study highlights and centers an intergenerational understanding of identity and socio-political consciousness development of queer Latinx college student activists. Specifically, the way that it disrupts traditional notions of development by bringing the years beyond the undergraduate experiences. So a particular focus of my work was thinking about how we engage with alumni, right, to reflect back on their experiences. And so you can see that in the different collaborators of the study, it wasn't just, you know, students who had just graduated. It was like students who had graduated and were out of the university for 10 plus years, right, who were reflecting back on their experiences. But part of it was that they had a lot of these folks, most of these folks knew each other, not because they attended school together, but because they were committed to the work that was being done at UNLV and the broader Las Vegas community. And so how do we engage intergenerational knowledge as both an activist practice, but also as part of the developmental experience for college students? And lastly, an ofrenda of queer kinship and building. Not all students have access to faculty and staff that share similar identities and experiences. Therefore, it is important that faculty and staff acknowledge their own privilege in supporting students through the developmental process and assist in creating spaces that honor queer and Latinx people. You know, an example of this is how do cultural centers, specifically Latinx cultural centers, create joteria spaces, create queer and trans spaces for queer and trans Latinx people, not as a subset of Latinx identity, but as a part of acknowledging that queer and trans people are a part of the Latinx community, right? And so how do we challenge the heteronormative ideas that oftentimes are embedded with the ways that we think about Latinx AO college students in higher education? And so at this time, I will stop my presentation, but I definitely want to engage in question and answer with folks who are on the Zoom.
Perfect. Thank you, Roberto. It looks like there is one question in the Q&A box, but I will also go ahead and promote everyone to panelists if they want to rejoin as a panel, so they can, if they want to talk or, and turn off their video or whatnot, they can. Let's see. Take a second.
So the first question we have is one by Alfonso Ayala, who says, thank you for sharing this research. Such beautiful and important work. One of the findings you shared is that through being in safe communal spaces, the collaborators were able to reflect on their own gender, sexuality, identities. I'm wondering, did you see a similar connection between personal identity, communal understanding with regards to ethnic identity? So I think part of what I saw in the dissertation is that the collaborators had different experiences, really thinking about their Mexican, Chicanx, Latinx identity when they were on campus with other queer and trans Latinx people, as opposed when they were in community spaces, which were oftentimes very Mexican-centric. And so I think part of these, being in these two spaces really pushed them to think broader than just, identifying as Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx, Mexican for them. And it was really about how do we really engage with ethnic identity as more than just Mexican and Chicano identity, right? But part of that, I think, was their joteria politics that they brought in, is that they really tried to challenge. Again, a lot of them were part of Mecha, right? So in Mecha, you're really socialized to have this kind of like Mexican-centric, Chicanx-centric identity. And we've seen that Mecha has shifted, right? In thinking about that, Mecha is no longer just for Chicana, Chicanx students. And so I think there was a difference in the ways that they engaged their ethnic identity with their peers on campus, who had kind of this more understanding of ethnic identity being just more than just Mexican, and Chicano, as opposed to when they were in community spaces, because of the people who were attending, but also the ways that, oftentimes in these immigrant rights movements spaces, it was more like immigration rights is a Mexican issue, right? Or it's a Latinx issue. And it wasn't like not even thinking about Latinx, but more of a Mexican issue. And so the Muxeristas really challenged, like, how do we think about immigration as more than just a Mexican issue, right? Just because we're on the US-Mexico border. And so, especially the younger generations of Muxeristas, 2015 to 2017, when the conversation of Black Lives Matter was happening, right, is how do we also acknowledge Black immigrants in this movement, specifically within Las Vegas, because it's not just, again, Mexican immigrants. So I don't know if that answers your question, but they definitely saw a difference in how they viewed their ethnic identity, both on campus and off campus.
There's another question from Angel. They said, how can we contextualize this framework within community college context for QT Latinx students? Yeah,
so I'll be honest, I haven't really thought about that. I don't really have an answer for that question. I think in community college context, I will say that the majority, I believe, like 2/3 of the collaborators came from a community college context, in that they were transfer students. And so for them, even though they were in community colleges, they were still heavily involved with UNLV as a four-year university. But when I asked them about like their experiences in, how did you choose UNLV? Why did you choose to come here? What was your path of education? A lot of them didn't view UNLV as attainable for them. They said, for me, it was more about like going to community college, right? And so, again, most of them had that community college experience where they transferred over to UNLV, but that was because of the relationships that particularly Dr. Anita Revilla had with a lot of the Muxeristas, right, in the area. But for me, I think when we think about community college context, is really acknowledging what are the experiences that students are bringing into the community college, and how do we think about their queer and trans identities outside of potentially the services that are being offered, right, or the spaces that are being offered in community college contexts, right? And so what are support systems that are being created outside of the community college context, when sometimes there may not be like centers for social justice, or there may not be the similar resources that there may be at four-year community colleges. And so for me, I think that's the way that I contextualize this study, is thinking about queer and trans Latinx students more broadly outside of the four-year experience, right? So I don't have like a direct answer in terms of community colleges, because I haven't really done that work with my research. But it is definitely an area, right? When we think about, the increasing number of Latinx students, where they're going is how are we creating these queer and trans spaces, these Muxerista spaces in different college contexts, right? But again, my research was at a four-year university, even though more than 2/3 of the students came from the community college context.
Thank you, Roberto. Are there any other questions? Oh, looks like Lisa asked, can you expand on your ideas of the stages of, I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher this word, but conocimiento as
Yes.
reciprocal spaces. Okay.
Yes. So part of how I view college student development is not as this stage model, a linear stage model, but one where it's very contextual, based on individual experiences, right? And so for me, the path of conocimiento allows us to go back and forth between, our consciousness or our negotiations that we have to continue to do as queer and trans people. So I do, I name the path of conocimiento as a joteria framework, as a queer and trans framework for queer and trans Latinx people. So for me, I always think about how somebody can be in a space of spiritual activism when they've come to really be unapologetic with other queer and trans Latinx people, but then I can come into a context that not pushes me, but where I have to go back to the space of Nepantla, where I have to continuously negotiate my identity with those around me, because I may not feel safe, and I may not feel like they're able to hold the space for me. So for me, reciprocity within the path of conocimiento is something that allows us to really see the path of conocimiento as this fluid kind of developmental process, as more than just a linear, achievable process, right? Because the path of conocimiento also is centered on growth. And for me, I think that's what's really important about it. It's not just, oh, you went through these stages and you completed them, but that the path of conocimiento is a path of, change that we're always going to go through as queer and trans Latinx people.
Any other questions for Roberto?
So I thank you all for the questions, for sharing space, for being in community with me today. Thank you to AAHHE for the opportunity to share my work alongside the other outstanding dissertation winners as well. I wanted to share my Twitter and my email if anyone has any follow-up questions. I'm always willing to share this work with your students, with your staff, with your faculty as well, to see how I can support and to share this framework with others. But I want to thank every one of you who are here in community with me today for sharing space.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you, everyone, for attending.